Chapter 5. Master of the Universe. The door was open to all comers. Even the loosest of the band's rehearsals would be witnessed by any number of visitors, staff from the magazines, friends from the street. All were welcome and many threw their own thoughts into the brew. Robert Calvert dropped by to watch and throw in some poetic raps over riffs that appealed. Michael Moorcock came on board, while Barney Bubbles made it clear that his artistic talents were firmly at the band's beck and call. I think the first thing Barney did for us was when we needed a poster, and I asked if he could do something. He came up with the Peace and Love poster, then some other things. He did a series of posters for the band, with us all represented as different characters. He also designed a Hawkwind tarot that was published in the International Times. They were all labors of love, and they all became something that was instantly identifiable with Hawkwind, helping us get our name around. Others, too, threw in faces and names that meant nothing outside of their own little universes, but all with an ear for Hawkwind Zoo and an eye for the possibilities that were shaping themselves within the formless morass of sound. It's quite a big family thing, Hawkwind, agrees Brock. Very family-oriented, with the friends and fans, and all the different characters going in and out of the band, and they all give a little bit. Some make little doodles, some create major landscapes, some do great portraits. And that's the way it has always been. Nobody is bigger than the band. It's like a soap opera. You get these soap opera stars and they think they're so big that they can leave the show and go off and do something else. All they end up doing is opening supermarkets. At the very core of the experience, the band members admitted, they just wanted to freak people out. By portraying different trips and utilizing their own experiences to do so, they knew exactly how to get through to people. When Hawkwind Zoo played Paranoia, one review claimed, people either pass out, freak out, or run out screaming. Maybe the International Times got it right, back at the dawn of Hawkwind's career. The mood's the thing, and Hawkwind are superb at creating an atmosphere. They've often been compared to the Pink Floyd, which is perhaps unfair, as Hawkwind are basically funkier than the Floyd have ever been. Also, they have a sense of humor that Waters and company seem to lack musically, at least. Humor and daring. One day, the band played a benefit for a local arts lab and were rewarded with an audio generator that the lab had just built. Dick Mick took immediate possession of it, and Nick is still adamant, it was the sound of that thing, the sound Dick Mick created, that became the iconic sound of the band, simply by virtue of its operator's ability to invoke a contrary musical uncertainty into the brew. Ordinarily merely a piece of electronic hardware designed for testing radio valves, Dick Mick insisted the oscillator was actually an undiscovered musical instrument, capable of evoking an entire new world of expression when it ran through an echo unit. Perched on the little card table he had adapted as its stand, it created the weirdest and most wonderful sounds. It was really wild and wacky and undisciplined and expressionist. Deep down, after all, Dave was a bluesman. He was like Duster Bennett. He even played the Buskers convention at the Royal Albert Hall. So he was basically a blues player, as was Mick Slattery. Everyone was from really diverse backgrounds really. John Harrison had played in Joe Loss's band. He was a big band bass player, really cool, and I went on to have my own big band, so it was quite an interesting mix. And then there was Terry, who was like this primitive drummer whose family were scrap dealers, and he played like a scrap dealer. We should have changed his name from Caveman to Scrapman. But it all just blended together. The mix of it was very diverse, and once Dick Mick came in, everything moved to another dimension. It was that diversity that allowed Hawkwind to get away with all that they did, the ease with which they absorbed the entire environment, pulling all of the senses into play and then making them work. Or, more bluntly, they wanted people to get stoned on the show, without the need for drugs. They even rehearsed with the strobes turned on them, and it really did get them high. So, Dick Mick assured everybody, with the revolving sheets of reflective plastic that he was constructing, to be placed in front of the speakers. As the plastic turned, Sound waves and light particles alike would be reflected into the audience and onto the stage, creating an entirely new experience for all. Songs emerged, a demo session beckoned. A friend named Don Paul, who had once organized a buskers tour that Brock was a part of, was now working at EMI and found himself as intrigued by Hawkwind Zoo as any other witness. He arranged for them to make their first ever recordings, lending them the Revox on which they would preserve Brock's largely acoustic Hurry on Sundown, one of his busking favorites, a cover of Pink Floyd's Cymbalin, and The Kiss of the Velvet Whip. Doug Smith knew precisely who to play the tape to. He was already in negotiation with Andrew Lauder, A&R man at Liberty Records, about a deal for Ch6. That was more or less in the bag, just a few more T's to cross and I's to dot. So he played Lauder the Hawkwind Zoo demo, and though the canny exec wasn't quite sure what to think, he agreed to give the new band a chance. They could record a single, and then see what happened, an agreement which Smith quickly managed to advance to an album, and, in November 1969, Hawkwind Zoo signed with Liberty. Andrew was pretty open-minded, Nik recalls. He'd traveled around, was very au fait with the American scene, and I think he saw what we were doing as akin to what was going on over there, and was therefore worth backing. He was very much in touch with what was current. The band's first act was to change their name, at John Peel's suggestion. The Zoo made it all sound too Haight-Ashbury, he said. They should just be Hawkwind. They were. Mick Slattery quit. Some friends of his had just returned from Morocco, and every word out of their mouths detailed what a fabulous place it was. Suddenly all Mick wanted to do was go to Morocco. He certainly wasn't impressed by the record deal. He'd been in bands who'd gone that route in the past, and nothing had ever come of it. He very much doubted that things would be different this time. All he could see, he told Nick, was a band whose highest ideals had already been cut down to capitalist size, selling out to the first man who offered them a check. It was the beginning of the end, he told himself wearily, and while his bandmates certainly didn't agree, regarded a record contact as a necessary first step towards making their voices heard, as opposed to their last gasp before they were silenced forever. Slattery booked that flight to Morocco. In his place came Lloyd Langton, a strip of kid whom Brock had met somewhere, and who seemed to be umbilically connected to his guitar. Brock at the time was fascinated by the notion that somewhere within Hawkwind's limitless explorations, the fabled lost chord awaited discovery. Young Ha agreed with him and later suggested they may even have found it. Well, that would at least explain the fate that awaited him, less than 9 months after he joined the band. Hawkwind were rehearsing regularly now, working on getting together sufficient material for an album, and playing any gig they could, free shows and benefits, opening for anyone who allowed them to, and all, they insisted, for the sheer love of playing. Let other bands worry about progressing and making great musical statements, having hit records and becoming rock superstars. Hawkwind played because that's what they did, part of a vast community that spread out from Notting Hill Central in great waves of expanding consciousness. They fell in with the Pink Fairies, a like-minded power chord that hovered on the verge of White Panther politics and had an in with every cause worth espousing at the time. C&D, release, legalis cannabis, squatters' rights, women's rights, racial equality, the free press, the underground arts, all could call upon the fairies to lend their weight to a benefit bill, and it's an indication of just how deeply Hawkwind threw themselves into the scene that soon, they were indeed a weighty proposition, a band whose name on a bill was guaranteed to swell audiences by at least as much as the fairies. The two bands met for the first time at the Hollywood Festival, staged near Newcastle-under-Lyme in Staffordshire. A bill creaking beneath the combined heft of Black Sabbath, Free, Mungo Jerry, Colosseum, and the first ever British appearance by the Grateful Dead was to be gate-crashed by the fairies, setting up their own stage on a flatbed truck. We'd been planning doing something similar ourselves, Nick says, so when we saw them setting up, we sent Doug Smith over to introduce himself. "Do you mind if my group get up and play, Boss Goodman, the Fairies manager, later admitted we were only too relieved to let somebody else get up there and have a bash. We played loads of gigs with them, Nik recalls. They were a good fun band, we did a lot of interesting gigs together, at least, I think they were good shows, although a lot of it was to do with the drugs as well. The past makes things seem much more magical, and absence makes the heart grow fonder. I know a lot of people remember the Pink Wind shows as highlights in their life, but they were actually quite hectic events. I remember a gig at the Marquee with them, a lot of gigs all over the place, lots of benefits and things at all these psych places. We would play separate sets, and then we had a big jam at the end. Loads of noise, 3 drummers, the fairies could be very incoherent sometimes, but we had a riff and we just went with it. Of course they were losing money, or, at least, they weren't making any. Nik acknowledges, we were doing a lot of gigs where we actually lost money. We'd do any gig we could get, benefits, support slots, free things, anything really. I organized a lot of the shows, I had some help with doing that, but it was me that people generally approached about doing benefits, and I'd mostly go along with the ideal and principle, since there was a genuine like-mindedness with the people who approached us, because they believed we'd be sympathetic to their causes. And we would. We did them to help people. People have said to me, more recently, oh, I was at this festival, and I was really worried because it looked like turning into a bad situation, and then somebody would say, oh, Nik Turner's arrived, and suddenly everything was alright. Well, that's a really nice thought. Me being there made everything okay, but I suppose there was some sense that I had this moral authority, if that's the right expression, to actually be respected by people and listened to, because they knew that I could see the bigger picture and could quell any problems that arose, and didn't take any bullshit. I found it quite natural and easy to be a peacemaker, and I didn't have a personal agenda except for people to be happy, harmonious, and have a good time. If their financial sense was poor, however, Hawkwind's reputation could only profit from the exposure. We had a reputation for playing until the plugs were pulled on us, newly recruited roadie Dal Ditmar later reflected. So a lot of times, the headline band would want to go on first, get it over with, and not have to worry about us. People would then come along, see us going on last, and think we were the headliners. That really helped build up the name. They continued to get by on busking and charity. Nik remained homeless, sleeping on whichever floors he was offered, and always making it a point to spend no more than one night in any one flat. He didn't want to wear out his welcome with anyone, and was rewarded by a growing circle of friends who never hesitated to invite him to stay. I didn't have anywhere to live, so I was on a different floor every night. It was all a bit of a hit and miss life really. I was still sleeping in the van a lot, in squats, on the floor at management. It was a question of finance. Hawkwind were going out and not really earning much. Some people still lived at home with their mums and dads, and I didn't have anywhere to practice, which was another problem. Some nights he crashed with his bandmates, some nights with the Fairies' irrepressible drummer Twink. I lived on Twink's floor for a time, when he was with his girlfriend Silva. Other nights he'd go to wherever the similarly drifting Robert Calvert was staying. Girlfriends, of whom there was a constant cycle, were a frequent port of call. In fact, in a strange way, it was easier when the band was playing out of town, in a strange town among strange people. The students that made up a large part of Hawkwind's audience were often happy to accommodate a band member or two, and Nik smiles as he remembers that he was never opposed to dressing in a manner that was sure to rally any good Samaritans in the crowd. He had the secret of street credibility down to a fine art, a ratty leather bike jacket and a pair of jeans with his arse hanging out. One look and it was clear that here was a musician who lived for the people he was playing music for, and they reciprocated with kindness. Besides, it was not as though he was on the take. Offer him your floor for the night and you would have a friend for life, a spot on the guest list when the band played again, an impromptu sax lesson if your ambitions flowed in that direction, a private concert if you didn't. And long into the night, he would sit and talk, a fount of cultural, artistic, and musical knowledge who wanted nothing more than to share all he could with other people. It was a role that he took seriously, an ambassadorial position that was far removed from Lloyd Langton's shyness, and Brock's quiet ambition. The guitarist did what he felt he needed to do to advance Hawkwind's cause, but rarely stepped beyond those parameters. He did not hang with the Ladbroke Grove crowd any more than he needed to, did not pay too much attention to the kids who wanted nothing more than to stand and talk all night about their own private dream for the betterment of mankind. Nik, in hindsight, I wonder what Dave's agenda was, at that time. Was he just going along with all these wacky things that we'd come up with? I do look back and wonder to what degree he was being manipulative, and had his own agenda whilst letting me, and others, go our own way setting up these things whilst he was reaping the benefit. Certainly when you listen to him these days, he's complaining about the amount of free gigs that we did in the 70s, but that was what got us respected in the counterculture. Dave talks a lot about the counterculture and the Notting Hill scene, but I was closest to the people, and in touch with that culture, living in squats, in the back of a van, on people's floors, in the management's office, very much of, and in touch with, the people. I was the point of contact between the band and the people. He stayed as far from it as he could. Brock could be relied upon to recruit new musicians when needed, and he usually made the right decision. But the extraneous people who added something else to Hawkwind, Calvert and Moorcock, Stacia the dancer, the artist Barney Bubbles, Liquid Len Smeaton and his battery of lights, Molten Mick, Mike Hart, and Astral Alan, Alan Day, John Leakey Lee, and John Perrin, they were the folk that Nik brought in, not only because he was the one they would gravitate to first, but also because he was the one who would listen to them first. Barney Bubbles was especially intrigued. He had spent time in San Francisco, hanging out with the Grateful Dead at the height of that band's association with Emmett Grogan's Diggers, an underground group who used to go round supermarkets collecting food that had been thrown out, and taking it down to the park and distributing it to the homeless. There was free food, free music, and a whole alternative thing going on, and Barney was very involved in it all, says Nik. And when he returned to London, he saw Hawkwind as the closest thing Britain had ever come to sparking a similar idealism. Not that Hawkwind had any time for glorying in such a glowing reputation. When the Grateful Dead made their UK debut, in an horrifically muddy field near Wigan, Hawkwind showered the sodden audience with goose feathers, and left the Dead to play out the remainder of their set before what looked like a sea of poultry. Yet Nik also instinctively understood Bubbles' evangelism, and agreed with it. Personally, he was as deserving a charity case as any of the people who approached Hawkwind with requests for a benefit concert or some other largesse. He was living in the street, eating out of paper bags from chip shops, staying in squats and sleeping on floors. But he was also doing something he loved, making music and playing in a band, and that did a lot to alleviate the hardships. If he was really analytical, in fact, he could tell himself that he brought them upon himself. He was educated, he was qualified, he was personable. The only thing that stood between him and a regular job, a regular lifestyle, was his refusal to even contemplate such a thing. Other people, he knew, were not so fortunate, had not deliberately taken a virtual vow of poverty. They were in their position through no fault of their own. So, just as he had with Robert Calvert, he took it upon himself to help them, and he dragged Hawkwind along in his wake. No matter that they were, as Doug Smith never failed to remind the promoters who booked them, Liberty Records recording artists. So far as Nik was concerned, and so far as great swathes of the underground believed, Hawkwind were the people's band, available any time to play a gig anywhere, and if there was no money to pay even basic expenses, then so be it. If anybody in the band deemed it a worthwhile course, then we would do it, however incompetently it might have been organized. We'd usually try to get our expenses paid, but very often we didn't get them. It really didn't matter at the time, though. It was just exciting being on the scene, being part of it, and being able to help people. Neither were Hawkwind alone in this predicament. A lot of other bands were loyal to the benefit circuit too, says Nik, recalling Help Yourself, the Sutherland Brothers, Skin Alley, Mighty Baby, whose manager, John Curd, was branching into promotion, and would soon become another Hawkwind ally, and the Edgar Broughton Band among their fellow freedom fighters. And then, of course, there was the Pink Fairies, although guitarist Paul Rudolph does make one very valid point when he discusses that band's proclivity for free festivals and benefits. The band would typically play and get paid only 2 or 3 nights a week. I wish there was more, but that's all our agency could muster. The free festival stuff or worthy benefit gigs were a way of filling in time when we didn't have a gig, although that always cost us money. And why was that? Because this was back in the day when free festivals and benefits were done for free, not for expenses as is the norm these days. I couldn't believe it when I heard that a well-known band was doing a benefit concert for free and had expenses paid, plus a rider for perks. Chapter 6. Be Yourself. The British underground scene never scaled the depths of its West German counterpart, where canny political operators seemed determined to ensure that all concerts everywhere were played for free, incurring the particular wrath of Deep Purple when one of that band's shows, in Lud and Schied, on December 8, 1970, was utterly disrupted by rioting students demanding free admission. But still there was a mood abroad that insisted that things needed to change, and that the era of the Fat Cat rock star was the first that needed addressing. Even before Hawkwind hurled themselves into the fray, 1969 to 1970 had proven an era of unfettered unrest and tumult as Europe witnessed the culmination of the years of, primarily, student revolt that had rocked so much of Western Europe over the past 2 years. Flashpoints for the violence were manifold and universal. America's continued involvement in the Vietnam War, and Western governments' refusal to condemn the increasingly barbaric slaughter, civil rights strikes, anti-poverty demonstrations, all played their own roles in igniting the ferment that saw the streets of Rome, Paris, London, and Berlin brought to a rebellious halt by rioting youth, and, of course, rock and roll played its own part in fanning the flames. But the peace and love rhetoric of such American imports as the Dead, the Airplane, the Fugs and so forth, had given way to a brutally inflammatory mood as the next generation of countercultural warlords, Mick Farron's Deviants, the Pink Fairies and Deep Purple's own Harvest Records label mates, the Edgar Broughton Band, arose from the most reactionary poles of the British counterculture to espouse an entire new world order. Establishing themselves at the very forefront of the battle, physically as well as culturally, their battle cries encompassed everything from the legalization of drugs to the redistribution of wealth and, in drawing up the battle lines along which this new revolution was fought, rock and roll itself was co-opted as the insurgents' most powerful weapon. One which, as Nik's old Berlin friends had insisted, should be available to everyone, free of charge. The problem with this, of course, was that, while bands like the Fairies, the Broughtons, and Hawkwind, the Deviants had broken up by now, might have been happy to spend their summers tramping from free festival to free festival, and living off the largesse of the revolution, other bands were somewhat less idealistic, were, in fact, adamant that a fair day's pay should accompany a fair day's work. It was a split that itself divided the rock scene viciously down the middle, rock and roll royalty raking in the cash on the one hand, the underground distributing it to the needy on the other. It would be some time before Nik's fellows in Hawkwind started complaining that they had maybe strayed onto the wrong side of that divide, and longer still before the group was actually in a financial position to bring those complaints out into the open. For now, Hawkwind were firmly on the side of the underdog, with Nik reinforcing their status by ensuring he was constantly rubbing shoulders with like-minded people. There was a lot of cross-fertilization between the bands, their management, and the underground media in every direction, says Nik. All of them vehicles for a lot of disparate creative energy and who, in turn, were attracted to Hawkwind because we were available to do gigs anywhere, and because we would play for free. In the eyes of the underground press, Hawkwind were the epitome of an underground band. So the media helped the band helped the media. And agendas were thrown to the winds. It is surprising, then, that it would be 1972 before the band's willingness to help so many disparate, and occasionally outlawed organizations came to the attention of the mainstream media, or maybe not, as 1972 was also the year in which Hawkwind themselves entered the mainstream, as Silver Machine became their first hit single. That year, Hawkwind played a benefit concert in aid of the so-called Stoke Newington 8 members of the Angry Brigade, whose trial for a series of some 24 bombings around the UK devoured 7 months of the year. Throughout 1970, however, the band played a number of shows whose beneficiaries might well have raised Special Branch's attention, as the Angry Brigade launched a series of attacks whose high-profile victims included a BBC outside broadcast unit during the 1970 Miss World event, a number of banks, several embassies, and even sundry governing Conservative Party MPs' homes. They were purposefully crimes against property alone. Just one person was injured across the entire span of the Angry Brigade's activities, which the police estimated to have numbered 25 separate bombings. Paranoia was rampant, on both sides of the divide. Searching for the perpetrators with only the dimmest notion of who, or where, they might be, the authorities simply mapped out the counterculture and descended upon it mob-handed. Ferry's manager Dave Boss Goodman and Mick Farron, flatmates in Maida Vale, were raided one night by the bomb squad, on the grounds that the International Times, which Farron was editing, had been receiving communiques from the Angry Brigade. Indeed, Farron made no secret whatsoever of his admiration for the group, leading many people in the underground to believe that he was involved. A lot of people regarded the Angry Brigade as heroes, Nik says. There was a lot of support for them in the counterculture, particularly as the government began coming down harder against dissent. Perhaps as a means of compensating for their helplessness in the face of all the strikes that were taking place, and which would end up paralyzing so much of the country. There was also a sense that the government had enough on their plate with Northern Ireland, without having to deal with domestic terrorism too, so there was a lot of police activity around the areas where the Angry Brigade were believed to have supporters and strongholds, a lot of innocent people getting hassled, and a mood of very real resentment bubbling up. In the midst of all this, we would be approached to play a benefit for this or that organization, and very often it was nothing we had ever heard of. But it sounded good, it sounded like the sort of thing we should be supporting, and it was only later, sometimes years later, that someone else would tell us, "Oh, you know that gig you played for so and so. The money went to buy bombs or explosives." We just didn't know. Occasionally their largesse publicly misfired. One night, at a college whose student body was largely drawn from military families, the band's habit of distributing copies of Friends to the audience landed them with an injunction. The magazine itself, insists Nik, was completely innocuous, but at the time there was a stir. Neither would every benefit the band agreed to play even take place. Many times, Hawkwind would arrive at a given venue, there to discover that the local authorities had already closed it down, that the organizers themselves had either given up or faded away, or that the necessary equipment simply hadn't arrived, which was the fate of the magnificently named Festival of the Oppressed on Election Day, a day-long protest event set to take place outside the stock exchange on the day of the 1970 general election. According to the International Times, what had happened, apparently, was that Edgar Broughton had promised to supply the equipment, but having turned up late for the afternoon session he freaked and wasn't seen again. But the real fault for the day's failure lies with the organizers whose abilities and resources didn't really match up to their grandiose schemes. Even a much anticipated clash with the stock exchange itself, whose owners had hired burly construction workers to break up the demonstration, never happened. Again, according to IT, the Bobby's police were obeyed to the word. Explained one of the organizers, "We were there to enjoy ourselves, not to clash with the pigs." Disappointed, Hawkwind, who were one of just several bands scheduled to perform, returned home, which on this occasion was thankfully just the other side of London, riven by recriminations as they cursed a wasted afternoon. One fact is undeniable, however, no matter how resentful some of the musicians may have grown as they watched another payday disappear into the ether. You could not buy publicity as good as Hawkwind's, and you couldn't buy an audience that was as loyal as theirs was becoming, either. Even by the standards of the time, Nik explains, Hawkwind was a very radical, alternative band, and we were approached all the time by people with ideas they wanted us to support in one way or another. I was a radical thinker, Robert Calvert was as well. I mean, to a certain extent some people just went along with the wacky ideas that we came up with. But the attitude, spirit, and ideals that we had were what generated the whole grassroots support which ultimately created the success of the band. That was what drew such creative people as Barney Bubbles, with his magical creative graphic genius and off-the-wall radical stage production ideas, and Michael Moorcock with his fantastical literary ideas, and creative involvement, endorsing the band, writing it into his books as the band of choice of his more interesting dimension-crossing characters. Mike then also co-created literary works which featured members of the band characterized as sci-fi heroes, out to save the world from the forces of evil and oppression. All of which gained the band further respect in the counterculture. Then there was the drugs. Yet none of this would have mattered, or at least it would not have allowed the band to prosper, and to survive, had the music not also been intact, and in that department, the twin propulsion of Nik and Dave Brock can never be overlooked. Each man had his own vision of what Hawkwind represented, and what it could achieve. Each has his own motivations within that vision. Occasionally they disagreed, frequently they would clash. But in their hearts, which in turn were the heart of the band, there was a chemistry whose fusion is the very sound of primal Hawkwind. Such partnerships are rare, even in the most rarefied atmospheres of rock. Lennon and McCartney had it. Jagger and Richards. Bowie and Ronson. Pairings where, no matter what the individuals might achieve alone, when they come together they are unimpeachable. Turner and Brock represented such a partnership, opposites in so many ways, but drawn together by the notes that they heard in their heads, and one instinctively looking to the other to complete the chord sequence. Sonic alchemy that, although it did not, and maybe could not, last for much more than 5 years, laid the framework for both men's futures.